How does one escape Commorragh, the Dark Eldar's eternal torture realm, by reciting tax codes? The answer lies not in courage, not in strength, not even in faith. It lies in something far more terrifying to the Lords of Pain: the complete inability to stop doing paperwork. Subject designation: Tiberius Vex, Administratum Clerk, Subsector Taxation Division, Segmentum Obscurus. 23 years of service, 847,293 forms processed without error. The clinical records note his psychological evaluation: functionally deceased, cause spreadsheets. He had not smiled in 17 years, not since discovering a decimal error in the M38 tax amendments that no one else had noticed. His greatest joy was finding discrepancies in shipping manifests. His only hobby was memorizing the complete Imperial Tax Code, all 97,000 volumes. His soul had been hollowed out not by the corrupting touch of chaos, not by the grinding horror of war, but by something far more insidious: the administratum's motivational techniques. Daily productivity quotas, efficiency reports filed in triplicate, the endless crushing weight of imperial bureaucracy. By the time the Dark Eldar found him, there was nothing left to break.
Agri-world Terminus 9. Population 7 million. Primary export: grain. Secondary export: boredom. The raid came during the quarterly audit. Dark Eldar reavers screaming through the atmosphere, their engines howling promises of exquisite agony. The Kabalite warriors moved with liquid grace, selecting their prey with the careful consideration of connoisseurs choosing wine. They sought the young, the vital, those whose screams would provide the sweetest sustenance. They found Tiberius Vex at his desk, reviewing grain tariff calculations. The first Kabalite to reach him paused. Even through their soul thirst, something felt wrong. The human hadn't looked up, hadn't screamed, hadn't even stopped writing. Section 7, subsection 4 requires documentation of all asset transfers, Vex stated, not lifting his eyes from his ledger. I'll need you to fill out Form 88 Delta. The Kabalite grabbed him anyway. As they dragged him to their raiding craft, Vex clutched his ledger with the desperate grip of a drowning man holding driftwood. Not from fear, from habit. The quarterly reports were due, and Emperor help him. He would complete them, even if it killed everyone around him.
The Dark City, Commorragh, a realm of endless twilight where screams were currency and suffering was art. The Kabal of the Flayed Smile had claimed him, their fortress spire thrust up from the lower wards like a diseased fang, its surfaces crawling with victims fused into the architecture itself, their mouths frozen in permanent screams. Homunculus Gelethir reviewed the new acquisitions personally, an artist of agony who had perfected the symphony of suffering over 7 millennia. Its body was a masterwork of self-modification, additional arms grafted from victims, eyes that could see into spectrums of pain invisible to lesser beings, fingers that had been replaced with surgical instruments so fine they could flay individual nerve endings. Entertainment Subject 4782. It designated Vex, its voice like grinding glass. Assigned to deep psychological reconditioning. Expected duration of resistance, 43 minutes. Predicted entertainment value, exquisite. Vex was processing the designation mentally. That numbering system is inefficient. A hexadecimal classification would reduce filing time by 12%. The homunculus paused. In 7,000 years, no victim had ever critiqued its filing system. It decided this one would scream louder than all the rest. They specialized in psychological torture. They'd never met someone whose psychology was already dead.
The torture chamber was a masterpiece of horror. Walls lined with implements that had no names in human language. Devices that could stretch time itself, making seconds feel like centuries. The air itself was weaponized, laden with toxins that amplified every sensation into agony. They began with the sphere of unmaking, a device that slowly dissolved reality around the victim, leaving them floating in a void of pure existential dread. Vex hung suspended in nothingness, no sight, no sound, no sensation except the slow dissolution of everything that defined existence. Most victims broke within minutes, their minds shattering against the infinite emptiness. During fiscal year 39,784, the imperial tithe collected from subsector Aurelia totaled 9.7 billion tons of refined promethium. However, due to clerical error 74B, only 9.6 billion tons were recorded. The homunculus operating the device checked its readings. The human's neural patterns showed no stress indicators, none. It was as if the void didn't exist for him. This discrepancy, Vex continued, requires Form 12 Alpha to be filed with annotations in subsection C, paragraph 4. They moved to the flaying chamber. Molecular disintegrators that could peel away layers of skin one cell at a time, each removal sending cascades of agony through neural pathways specifically enhanced to maximize pain reception. The first layer came away. Vex didn't flinch. Paragraph 4 states that all discrepancies exceeding 0.01% must be investigated by an appointed numerator savant. However, subsection C contradicts this by stating that discrepancies under 0.05% may be resolved through administrative discretion. Second layer. Third. Fourth. This contradiction has existed since the amendments of M36. I have filed 47 requests for clarification. None have been answered. The homunculus increased the intensity. Nerve endings fired in sequences designed to overwhelm the brain's capacity to process trauma. The pain should have been beyond comprehension. Furthermore, Vex stated, as his entire epidermis was systematically destroyed, the lack of standardization between Forge World shipping protocols and Agri-World distribution matrices creates inefficiencies that cost the Imperium approximately enough. Zalathir's translator barked. The device shut down. The human continued talking about quarterly projections.
Word spread through the torture halls. A human that couldn't be broken, not through courage or faith, those they had seen before. This was something else, something wrong. Homunculus Yakarath took the challenge, a specialist in memory manipulation. It would trap Vex in his worst memories, amplified and twisted until madness was the only escape. The neural crown activated. Vex's consciousness was pulled backwards through time to his most traumatic moment, the moment that had broken him, the moment that had destroyed his capacity for joy forever. They found themselves in an administratum office, endless rows of desks stretching to infinity, the sound of quills scratching on parchment like insect legs on glass. And there, at desk 77,425, sat young Tiberius Vex, age 23 standard, discovering the decimal error in the M38 tax amendments. No one else noticed. An error that had been copied and recopied for 600 years, affecting every transaction since. The compound interest alone, Yakarath fried to twist the memory, to transform it into horror. But how do you horrify someone whose worst nightmare is already a spreadsheet error? How do you break someone who broke themselves decades ago over a misplaced decimal point? The correction required recalculating every transaction in the subsector for 6 centuries. I requested permission. It was denied. The error remains. Every day it compounds. Every day, the Imperium loses resources that could supply 3 regiments of guard. The memory collapsed, not from the homunculus's manipulation, but from Vex's complete lack of emotional response to it. They tried the symphony of screams, surrounding him with the amplified death cries of 10,000 victims. Vex listened with his head tilted slightly. The acoustic patterns suggest inefficient victim placement. If you arranged them by tonal frequency, you could achieve 12% better resonance. They tried the Garden of Flesh, where victims were transformed into living sculptures of meat and bone, conscious but unable to scream. The biomass allocation is wasteful. Form 567K clearly states that all organic resources should be catalogued for potential servitor conversion. Each failure fed the frustration. Each monotone observation was worse than any scream. Vex had weaponized his entire career. Each regulation was a blade, each subsection ammunition. The Imperial Tax Code, all 97,000 volumes, was his arsenal. And unlike a lasgun, it never ran out of charge.
But Vex wasn't resisting torture through courage. He was torturing them through habit. The Dark Eldar had finally met something worse than pain. A man who couldn't stop filing paperwork. The truth was far more terrible than any act of defiance. He wasn't choosing to recite tax codes. He couldn't stop. 23 years of conditioning had carved grooves in his mind so deep that even the most exquisite agony couldn't pull him out of them. He was a machine made of meat, running a program that couldn't be terminated. The Kabal of the Flayed Smile prided itself in innovation and agony. When word spread that they had a subject who couldn't be broken, it became a matter of honor, of reputation, of survival in the twisted hierarchy of Commorragh. Homunculus Dracareth arrived with confidence. "You're approaching this wrong. Physical pain, psychological manipulation,
primitive. Watch and learn. It produced a device of its own design, the neuron lattice. It would map every synapse in Vex's brain and manually trigger each one in sequences designed to produce pure, undiluted suffering at the quantum level of consciousness itself. The device activated. 10 million neural pathways fired simultaneously. Vex's entire nervous system became a symphony of precisely orchestrated agony. In accordance with Regulation 977-3B, all experimental procedures require prior authorization from the Department of Compliance. Have you filed the necessary forms? Dracareth's confidence cracked. There are no forms. This is torture. Incorrect. Article 16 of the Lex Imperialis states that all activities within imperial space or affecting imperial citizens must be documented. By capturing me, you've created a de facto administrative relationship. I'll need your designation number for the records. I don't have a designation number. Then I'll assign you one. You are now Entity X79943B. Please note this for future correspondence. Another homunculus tried, then another, each bringing their masterwork, their magnus opus of agony, the infinity mirror that trapped souls in recursive loops of their own death, the enzyme cascade that dissolved and regenerated tissue in endless cycles, the temporal fracture that allowed them to torture someone in multiple timelines simultaneously. Through it all, Vex continued his recitation, not as an act of will, not as defiance, simply because stopping never occurred to him. The grain shipments from Terminus 9 show a discrepancy of 0.003% when compared to orbital measurements. This suggests either clerical error or localized theft. Form 234C recommends investigation, but Form 456D suggests administrative resolution. The contradiction— "Make him stop!" a Kabalite warrior screamed from outside the chamber. They'd been listening for 6 hours. "Please, just make him stop talking about grain shipments."
Zalathir's reputation was crumbling. 7 millennia of perfecting the art of suffering, destroyed by a single human who wouldn't stop discussing tax law. Other cabals were beginning to whisper. The cabal of the poisoned tongue suggested that perhaps the Flayed Smile had lost their edge. The Hex traded jokes about it in the fighting pits. How many homunculi does it take to torture an accountant? Doesn't matter. The accountant will bore them to death first. Desperate times required desperate measures. Zalathir called upon Vorech the Immortal, a homunculus so ancient it claimed to remember the fall itself. Its very presence caused reality to weep. Its knowledge of suffering transcended physical law. Vorech examined Vex for 17 seconds. Then it left without a word. Later, in the shadow-shrouded subspire where the eldest homunculi gathered, Vorech made its pronouncement. "The monkey cannot be tortured. It is already in hell. Its hell is spreadsheets. It has been there so long it no longer recognizes any other reality. We are not torturers to it. We are merely interruptions to its filing." The assembled homunculi, beings who had tortured demon princes and made aspect warriors beg for death, shuddered. Meanwhile, in the torture chamber,
Vex had moved on to explaining the proper protocols for cross-referencing shipping manifests with orbital cargo recordings. His audience of torturers had dwindled. 3 had requested transfers. 1 had entered voluntary stasis rather than listen to another word about form submissions. The assigned guard stood outside, the duty considered punishment worse than flaying. They could hear him through the door. The inefficiency is compounded by the lack of standardization between Forge worlds. For example, Forge World Metallica uses a base 8 counting system for bulk materials, while Forge World Lucius uses base 12. The conversion errors alone.
The final assessment came from the Archon himself, as Tiberius Vex representative arrived in a gravity-defying palanquin carried by lobotomized grotesques. It observed for precisely 5 minutes. Asset classification, unusable. Threat level, mimetic. Recommended action, immediate disposal. But disposal required paperwork, forms to be filled, procedures to be followed. Even in the anarchy of Commorragh, certain protocols existed. The Dark Eldar clerk assigned to process Vex's termination lasted 30 seconds before screaming, "He's trying to help me with the forms! He keeps correcting my filing system!" They tried to move him to the disposal chambers. He began explaining why their prisoner transportation methodology was inefficient. The guards stopped halfway, looked at each other, and simply walked away. They tried to feed him to the various creatures in the fighting pits. The beasts retreated to the far corners of their cages rather than listen to another word about imperial taxation. Finally, they simply forgot about him. Not through any mystical means, but through the simple expedient of everyone involved refusing to acknowledge his existence. His cell was removed from patrol routes. His designation was deleted from the records. He became an unthing, a filed and forgotten error in their system. Except he wouldn't stay forgotten. His voice carried through the ventilation systems. The quarterly reports for M41.867 show a pattern of inefficiency in... Guards would suddenly remember they had urgent business elsewhere. Homunculi would discover pressing experiments in other sections. Gradually, an entire section of the fortress spire became abandoned. The dead zone, they called it, where the boring thing lived. He'd discovered the only thing Dark Eldar fear, being bored by their own entertainment. It wasn't an escape. Not really. It was more like administrative error resolving itself. Vex simply walked out of his cell one day, not because he'd planned it, not because he sought freedom, but because it was the end of the fiscal quarter and the reports were due. He walked through the corridors of the torture fortress, still reciting from memory. The discrepancy in grain shipments requires immediate reconciliation with Form 101J. A Kabalite warrior saw him, raised its splinter rifle, hesitated, remembered 17 hours of testimony about proper filing procedures, lowered the weapon, and walked away quickly. Another group of guards spotted him approaching a checkpoint. The sergeant looked at his squad. "Anyone want to stop him?" Silence. "That's what I thought. Let him pass." He wandered through the lower wards of Commorragh, a small gray figure clutching a blood-stained ledger, mumbling about tax codes.
Witches preparing for death matches stepped aside. Hellions revving their skyboards fell silent as he passed. A mandrake, a literal shadow assassin from the spaces between reality, manifested briefly, heard him discussing import duties, and immediately returned to the shadow realm. A group of witches saw him approaching their deathmatch arena. The succubus, a being who'd killed 1,000 warriors in single combat, held up one hand. Match postponed. Administrative issue. They waited until he passed, then waited 5 more minutes, just to be sure. A slave rebellion was occurring in the nexus of shadows, hundreds of escaped prisoners fighting desperately for freedom. Vex walked through the middle of the battle, completely oblivious, still talking. The ammunition expenditure here exceeds acceptable parameters. Form 23K suggests a 12% reduction in... Both sides stopped fighting to let him pass. He reached the webway portal to Terminus 9 purely by accident. He'd been following what he thought was the route to the filing department. The portal guards, who should have killed him instantly, were having a discussion. Is that the boring one from the dead zone? Should we stop him? Do you want to listen to another lecture on proper documentation? Let him through. And so Tiberius Vex, administratum clerk, walked out of Commorragh. Not through strength, not through cunning, not through courage, but through the simple, terrible power of being too boring to endure. The Kabal of the Flayed Smile conducted a post-incident analysis. Reputation in Commorragh was everything, and they'd just let a slave walk out. Except they hadn't let him. They'd expelled him, like an organism rejecting a poison. The records, when reviewed, were damning. 47 hours of continuous administrative recitation, 19 homunculi requesting reassignment, 3 entering voluntary stasis, 1 attempting suicide, unprecedented for beings that couldn't truly die. An entire section of Fortress Spire abandoned. Productivity in torture chambers down 60% due to staff sick days, a concept that hadn't existed in Commorragh before. Xilothia's final report contained a single recommendation: screen all future subjects for administratum employment. Classification: existential hazard. The Archon's response was even briefer. Agreed. And if we ever capture another accountant, just kill it. Quickly. From a distance. A new addition was made to the Cabal's tactical doctrine, filed under extreme threats. Demon princes, approach with caution. Aspect warriors, lethal force authorized. Imperial accountants, do not engage.
Deep in the bowels of Terra, in a vault that officially didn't exist, a new initiative was born. Project Tedium. If one accountant could walk out of Commorragh through sheer boredom, what could 100 do? 1,000? They began recruiting from the darkest depths of the administratum. The clerks who'd spent 40 years cataloging different types of nutrition paste. The scribes who'd memorized every contradiction in imperial law. The adepts who'd gone mad from filing and then gone sane again because madness was less organized than they preferred. The training was simple. They were locked in rooms and told to recite regulations while servitors attempted to distract them with pain inducers. Not one noticed the pain. They were too busy explaining proper formatting. The first test was conducted on a chaos cultist cell. The cultists surrendered after 4 hours, begging the Inquisition to take them rather than listen to another word about proper skull measurement protocols for the throne's tithe. The second test involved deploying a single accountant to a Drukhari raid. The raid ended with the Dark Eldar retreating through their webway portal while the accountant followed, still explaining why their slave-taking methodology was inefficient. The portal was permanently sealed from the other side. By M41999, Project Tedium had become the Imperium's most classified weapon. Not because it was powerful, but because if the enemies of mankind knew the Imperium was weaponizing boredom, they might surrender immediately just to avoid it. And Tiberius Vex? He remained at his desk on Terminus 9, processing forms, calculating tithes, reconciling discrepancies, unaware he'd become a legend, uncaring that his name was whispered in the dark corners of Commorragh as a curse. He had reports to file, after all. The quarterly assessments were due, and Emperor help anyone who stood between him and his spreadsheets.
The lesson is written in the Ledger of the Lost, filed under Victories, subcategory Inexplicable. The Dark Eldar, who have tortured Primarchs and broken the minds of custodians, were defeated by a man who couldn't stop doing his job. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The distinction matters. For in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, where courage is measured in blood and honor in death, sometimes the greatest weapon isn't a bolter or a chainsword or even faith itself. Sometimes it's a man so fundamentally broken by bureaucracy that even the masters of pain themselves cannot find anything left to break. A man who has transformed tedium into armor and boredom into a blade. The Dark Eldar fear many things: the hunger of she who thirsts, the wrath of their kin, the slow death of their hollow empire. But now they fear something else, something worse. They fear Form 88 Delta, submitted in triplicate with properly formatted subsections. They fear Tiberius Vex. The Emperor protects, Tiberius Vex processes. And in the grim darkness of the far future, sometimes the greatest weapon is a man who cannot stop doing his job, even when his job is killing everyone around him with boredom.